Monsoon season is nothing new for Pakistan. Throughout South Asia, summer involves heavy rain. It's been like that since at least the Ice Age. But 2022 was different. The rain started, and they just didn't stop. Some provinces saw more than 5 times the normal rainfall. The flooding was enormous. By September, 1/3 of Pakistan's land was underwater. 33 million people were directly impacted. Here's what that means. People had to leave their homes. The drinking water was contaminated. And crops, people's livelihoods, were destroyed.
But the number that really stuck with me as a mother of 3 children was that during this time, when people were homeless and didn't even have the shelter of a tent, let alone a home, there were 600,000 women who were going through different stages of childbirth.
This is Hina Rabbani Kar. She was Pakistan's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs at the time. While her country was still in crisis mode, Hina was part of a delegation to the United Nations in New York and was invited to speak on feminist foreign policy in a room full of women leaders from around the world.
And I said, we're all women. 600,000 women currently are without the protection of even a tent. And yet, many of you claim to have feminist foreign policies and are not able to say okay to the fund that is required to immediately be of assistance to, countries which are hit by climate events.
Back in 2009, at a UN summit in Copenhagen, wealthy countries had agreed to send money to lower-income countries to fight climate change. The fund was supposed to be $100 billion a year by the year 2020. As Hina's sitting in this room, they were still behind. That's what she's talking about. The situation has left countries like Pakistan and leaders like Hina frustrated, to say the very least.
Pakistan is probably the only country in the world where there are no climate deniers. And that's not by choice. That is by experience. Pakistan is disproportionately, like many in the developing world, but we are particularly disproportionately hit by climate change. And as someone who does not even contribute 1% to the emissions, we are particularly unlucky in that way. We are willing to go green all the way today. What's stopping us? Finances. Who's there to fill the gap? No one.
So there's this framework that climate people, like the ones in Hina's meeting, talk about when it comes to how we will address climate change. And it goes like this. We have 2 choices, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is when we reduce emissions from things like oil, natural gas, and coal. Adaptation is figuring out how to live with the impacts of a warming world, like building seawalls. The less we do of either of those, the more we will suffer. Today I'm going to focus on something that's a little bit of mitigation and adaptation. Let's call it a secret third category, something that sounds like science fiction. I'm Amy Harder, and you're listening to Shocked. Today, geoengineering. Mount Pinatubo is a volcano in the Philippines. It was long thought to be dormant, but for several days in June 1991, it erupted violently.
Mount Pinatubo ejected a high-pressured ash-laden steam column into the sky at 8:41 a.m.
Huge clouds of ash visible 60 miles away in Manila.
More evacuees are expected, especially from areas affected by the ash falls.
Falling ash turned day into night.
It was the largest volcanic eruption anywhere on Earth since 1912. As the ash settled, scientists noticed something incredible. The volcano had spewed nearly 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. That sulfur dioxide reflected sunlight back to outer space. The global temperature dropped by 0.5 degrees Celsius for the entire next year. That's the global temperature in the entire world, not just the Philippines. Scientists were watching, and if the goal is to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, Mount Pinatubo just achieved a third of that. So some scientists are thinking, why should we wait around for volcanoes? Could we somehow recreate a version of that to cool the planet?
The science that showed that sulfuric acid from volcanoes made stratospheric aerosols and cooled the climate was solid way before Pinatubo.
This is David Keith. He's a physicist at the University of Chicago.
In hindsight, one cool thing for Pinatubo is that there was a paper published before the cooling was visible that predicted quantitatively the amount of cooling they expected to see from Pinatubo, and they got it about right. And I think that's a really important thing for people to hear in terms of guessing whether they should believe any of the crazy stuff I'm saying at all. Because it's very easy for science to sound all convincing in hindsight, but the real test of science is, can it quantitatively predict things that haven't happened yet?
David's research focuses on that kind of predicting as it pertains to how we cope with our warming planet.
Temperature is one of the biggest drivers of human mortality. It's really temperatures, not extreme temperatures so much and not rainfall so much, as just temperatures.
David says that the science behind why volcanoes can lower those temperatures is actually pretty simple.
It's just the idea that if it's a little less sunny, it gets a little bit less hot. And we're all familiar that on days that have high hazy clouds, it'll get a little less hot, and that's because those high hazy clouds are reflecting some of the sunlight back to space.
And he does not want to wait for the next volcano to lower global temperatures.
I don't know of a single credible argument that that's not possible with solar geoengineering.
Solar geoengineering. It basically means technology that beams the sun's rays right back into space. If you think that sounds crazy, I thought so too. And that's why I came to David. He is the go-to guy on this technology. He's been driving research and investment in this area more than probably anyone else on Earth. If anyone could tell me how this is actually supposed to work, it would be him. So according to David, here's how it might go. First, we'll need air bases.
2 air bases, kind of one on each side of the equator, maybe one at 20 degrees north and 20 degrees south-ish.
From each air base, a fleet of around 100 jets takes off.
Could be less, could be more, depending on how big the aircraft are.
They climb into the sky until they reach an altitude of about 65,000 feet.
It's about exactly twice as high as a conventional jet that many of your listeners will have flown in.
Up there, those jets start spraying. Picture a crop dusting plane, except instead of spraying pesticides,
you'd be putting in something like, round numbers, 1 million tons of sulfuric acid in the stratosphere. When somebody says you're putting 1 million tons a year of sulfur in the stratosphere, it just seems insanely huge. Humans already put around 50 million tons of sulfur in the form of air pollution in the lower atmosphere every year anyway. So 1 million tons would be 2% of that.
And remember Pinatubo? That was closer to 20 million tons.
So we have already watched how nature reacted to getting hit with a 20 million ton sulfur hammer, and it cooled the Earth, and there was no drastic, terrible thing.
But without a conveniently timed volcanic eruption, where are we going to get that kind of sulfur? Is it just lying around?
Funny you should ask an Albertan who inevitably is tied to the fossil economy.
Alberta, Canada, if you don't know, produces most of the country's oil. David's from there.
Sulfur is one of the major waste products in the world, and much of it comes out of oil and gas.
But isn't an oil and gas waste product toxic or something?
Sulfuric acid or sulfur dioxide is the thing we know the best. I like to say it's the devil we know. And the advantage of it is we do know it's a harmful pollutant for sure, but we actually know in immense detail how harmful it is, and so we're unlikely to have big unknown unknowns.
Unknown unknowns. So much of David's job is about minimizing them. And when it comes to geoengineering, it does feel like there are a lot. For example, some people even worry that the technology could be used as a weapon. There is history to this. During the Vietnam War, the United States dropped silver and lead iodide into clouds above North Vietnam to provoke heavier rain. It was called Operation Popeye. It reportedly extended the monsoon season by 30 to 45 days. The UN later banned the use of such technologies in warfare. David Keith isn't worried about this, though.
The stratosphere sort of takes 2 years to mix, and pretty much it mixes over each hemisphere, which means you can't localize it. And that means you can't weaponize it.
In other words, if someone tried to make one part of the world a lot colder, they'd make their part of the world a lot colder too. There are people who are worried about the flip side of the coin, that individual countries won't be able to decide to geoengineer their own skies without impacting others, and that we don't have the international governance in place to make sure those decisions are made collectively and fairly. And for a long time, some of those heavy hitters who are in those international conversations painted geoengineering as a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card for carbon emissions. And it's interesting because they once had the same attitude towards adaptation to climate change.
Al Gore and other people around him argued very strongly that it was immoral to even talk about adaptation because it would take the pressure off cutting emissions. And I think in hindsight, that was empirically wrong and ethically wrong. The people who want to do the adapting are the poorer people in the world who want to reduce their harms. And the idea that we should not allow them to reduce their harms because we want more moral pressure on the rich and the oil companies is just ethically insane.
Al Gore has since changed his mind and has written that both approaches are necessary. Adaptation has become widely accepted because people are experiencing a warming world. Mitigation is not enough. I think geoengineering might get to that level of acceptance too, but it probably won't stop fossil fuel companies from using it as a get-out-of-jail-free card.
And I think it is likely that fossil-rich nations or fossil fuel companies will at some point choose to exaggerate how well solar geoengineering is working or could work in order to reduce the political pressure to cut emissions.
So far, we've been discussing solar geoengineering, throwing matter up into the sky. But there's another form of geoengineering that has begun to be applied already. It removes matter from the sky, specifically carbon dioxide. In fact, David spent years developing the technology that could do this. It's called direct air capture because, well, it is capturing carbon dioxide directly from the air. He did this work through a startup aptly called Carbon Engineering. In 2023, the oil company Occidental Petroleum, often called Oxy, bought Carbon Engineering. The thing is, Oxy is using the carbon dioxide that's captured from the air to get more oil out of its wells. Not exactly the end use that an environmentalist would hope for.
But I think ultimately, big picture, I'm pretty comfortable with Oxy and other oil companies developing that technology. And I think the reason I'm comfortable with it is that they're not doing it because they're suddenly become green and good. And I don't really think they have. They're doing it because they're following the political winds. So the way I see it is the reason, if you like, that Oxy, decided to act on direct air capture and buy carbon engineering is because Oxy felt real pressure to do it. And that pressure came from a bunch of things, including the IRA and other growing government rules and incentive programs. And those incentive programs didn't come because Biden just woke up being green. Those rules came because of environmental action. And what we as environmentalists should want are this heavy infrastructure decarbonization to get built.
The IRA that made this a good investment for Oxy is a really big law. It was a huge achievement for the Biden administration and incentivized a lot of investments in new clean technology. The Trump administration, along with Republicans in Congress, have dismantled most of that law. I emailed David to get his latest take. He said that the Trump administration will no doubt slow things down, but it matters less than one might think. These are global businesses. If companies like Oxy think that they can make money selling carbon removal, then they'll invest. And because geoengineering has lately been singled out as part of a conspiracy by the far right, I asked David about that too. He said that it is extraordinarily difficult to guess where it goes next. But right now, as an environmentalist, David sees geoengineering as a tool of adaptation that we need to embrace, starting with research. How much research is needed to make a decision to begin to deploy it at a small scale? And are we at that level of research?
There's no objective answer to how much research is needed. That's fundamentally a political judgment, and different politicians or political parties or governments will make their own decisions. So that is one of those questions that's phrased in the language of science, but a scientist should not answer that question. Scientists may, other ones you may interview may want to give you an answer, but it's just not a science question.
So who is going to answer this question? That's after the break.
If you're enjoying the discussions that we're having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show that you should check out. It's called the Chicago Booth Review Podcast. What's the best way to deliver negative feedback? How can you use AI to improve your business strategy? And why is achieving a soft landing so hard? The Chicago Booth Review Podcast addresses the big questions in business, policy, and markets with insights from the world's leading academic researchers. It's groundbreaking research delivered in a clear and straightforward way. Find the Chicago Booth Review Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
When Pakistan was hit by the floods, I remember I was at the Foreign Office at the time.
That's Hina Rabbani Kaur again. Remember, she was Pakistan's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs back in 2022, just after the historic floods. She was talking to other government officials about what it would take to recover.
I said, okay, we're doing a lot of talk on it. Let's go to the drawing board and see what funds are available where. Guess what? We were on the board of the most important funding sources for climate change. And you know what was available? Literally nothing.
It was a huge wake-up call. Hina knew that people needed immediate relief from this disaster and long-term funding for the next one.
When it comes to adaptation, because look, this is going to continue to happen. So what can you do? When it came to mitigation, have we been able to decrease fossil fuel production? I mean, not so much. The whole world has much to be blamed for it, but not so much. But because we know these disasters are going to continue to come, we need to adapt as fast as possible.
That same year as the floods, Hina joined a commission looking into various adaptations, including solar geoengineering. It's also called solar radiation modification.
I will admit at the very outset that when I first became member of the commission and one of the first meetings we had, and when solar radiation modification was first discussed, I was the first one to point out this is and must remain an absolute no-go area.
Hina was one of those people who worry that we don't have the international systems in place to make sure we apply geoengineering fairly.
If one country decides to deploy it large scale, the impact is not going to end on the geography of that country.
And she wasn't sure that people pushing for it were totally considering all the potential effects. The unknown unknowns, to borrow David Keith's words.
I said sometimes the problems that we try to solve create bigger problems as ramifications of our intention to do something good.
As Hina worked with the other commissioners, these arguments started to sway her.
I will happily admit that I am a convert on the question of exploring and researching geoengineering.
We still need to decarbonize our economy and our atmosphere. Hina does still worry that overly focusing on geoengineering could distract from the foundational changes that society must make.
We categorically say that solar radiation modification should never be used as something that can fill in for mitigation, for cutting emissions.
David Keith also knows we can't control all of those.
If this is ever done at scale, it will certainly make some people worse off, for sure. Any public policy does. And also it were for sure have some unexpected results that we're not happy with. Any large-scale intervention on anything always does.
I also think it's important to remember that we are currently undergoing a massive experiment with global warming itself.
And if it is used to lower temperatures, then these benefits really go sort of just to the opposite of where climate damages go, which is hot places and especially poor people living in hot places. And the data for that is quite strong.
There are so many things about geoengineering that we can't know until or unless it happens. I asked Hina about that. How worried are you about unintended consequences of geoengineering?
I am very, very, very worried about unintended consequences of everything in life. Personal life, political life, diplomatic life, and certainly SRM life. Whatever tools might be available as a last option, I would much rather be informed about the full itinerary of its ramifications than being in a guesswork of what may happen and what may not happen.
And this feels like something that Hina shares with David. This desire to know all the unknown unknowns for herself.
If I talked about it 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said this quite differently. I was always starting saying, well, there's all these risks and uncertainties, but it might be worth studying. And I think that a bunch of us are trying to say that, well, of course there are risks and uncertainties. Objectively, the level of confidence that we have that some version of it, that's crucial, could actually have these very large benefits and comparatively small risks. I think many of us in this community are starting to say, we just need to say that out loud.
When you lay it out this way, I can't help but think, why don't we just do this and forget about everything else, all this clean energy? Why don't we just geoengineer our way out of this problem?
I think that's a really easy answer, because if you just kept putting more CO2 in the atmosphere, you'd have to keep turning down the sun by doing more and more geoengineering, basically turning one knob up and the other knob down in a way where the risks of what happens if you stumble and like the geoengineering stops get to be enormous. So the answer is that's insane. The long run risks of climate change are due to the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere, and geoengineering cannot change those. If you want to defuse the carbon bomb, you have to first stop building a bigger bomb, and that means not emitting carbon dioxide. That means decarbonizing the economy. Then you have to kind of deal with the bomb you have, which might be geoengineering and adaptation. And then there's gradually defusing the bomb, which is taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
That brings me back to my question about geoengineering our way out of this mess.
The one thing to keep with this analogy that we know would not work is to keep building the bomb bigger by putting more CO2 in the atmosphere and at the same time doing more and more geoengineering. People so often see this as a binary choice, a big red button where we use solar geoengineering in case of emergency if other things don't work. If you ask me to decide right now whether the world should commit itself irrevocably to a geoengineering program, I would absolutely vote no and oppose it really hard to anybody doing that. But that's a kind of false question. It would be crazy to commit yourself irrevocably. This, like many other policies, are inherently iterative.
That kind of iteration hopefully leaves room for more voices to be part of the conversation.
So in Pakistan, we typically say, if somebody says, oh, I cannot decide which movie to watch, and we say, oh, you have a developed world problem. Okay. So when people make it a political debating issue, they're playing with the lives of many, 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 many people. They're playing with the planet. Okay. I used to think that whenever I work on climate change, I do it for my children. Guess what? I was really doing it all along for myself because it really came upon us faster than we thought it would, right? I mean, how many of us have not seen weather pattern change? So I came with a woolen coat to Chicago after having Googled as to what weather should be like, right? And I'm wearing a linen shirt. And now the only cost to me is carrying the woolen coat. The cost of climate denying to people in the rural and urban centers of countries like mine is far more than the cost that I've had to pay. Okay, so I think we just need to be real. I think so much is lost in this fight, us versus them. And that's why I think it's really important that we take climate change out of that fight between North and South. It's not a brown-white debate, it's a humanity debate. And we must not let it fall through the cracks of brown, white, North, South, East, West. It's a humanity issue. It doesn't know ethnicity, nor color, nor creed, nor geography, nothing.
Geoengineering is such an enormous topic. After talking with David and Hina, I wanted to catch up with Michael. As you know, he could probably give David Keith a run for his money when it comes to being blunt. This is so frustrating and unfair for someone like Hina. Pakistan is not responsible at all for the climate change that we're experiencing today, and yet her country is experiencing it and is least equipped to handle it. And because of that, one thing people are talking about is geoengineering. What do you think about that?
Hina, who I admire so much, there's something that I really disagree with her about. She says it's not a brown or white debate. It's a humanity debate. And I think what that misses is climate change is not going to affect the world equally. It's incredibly unfair, and it's going to be incredibly unequal. And the costs are going to live extremely disproportionately in Pakistan and other countries. So unfortunately, I think Hina's not quite right about some communitarian perspective about this. It is the very unequal costs are going to land in some places. Meanwhile, in rich countries like the OECD countries, for the next couple decades, climate change will kind of be a wash in terms of damages. There'll be some benefits, there'll be some costs. They're going to roughly balance each other out.
I see your point, Michael, even though it is pretty depressing that that's the case. If it is the case, then what's next?
Well, look, I think the temptation, my day job as an academic, I'm always reminded of a headline in The Onion that researchers call for more research. So the temptation is to say, hey, there should be more research. But I want to appeal to a voice that's often in my head. I call them the VP of Common Sense. What would the VP of Common Sense say? And I think what the VP of Common Sense would say is, hey, we got people today dying in our countries because of these extreme temperatures. And you're telling me there's a technology, it's pretty cheap, we could unleash it and I could save lives today. Why wouldn't I do that? And so in some sense, I think the discussion around geoengineering is made much more complicated by layering climate change over it. And the notion that we're not actually conducting, once you introduce climate change, the notion that we're not actually already conducting an experiment by pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, that's like fantasy. We are doing that experiment. So should we do another experiment called geoengineering to try and mitigate some of those effects? If I were king of Pakistan or India, they don't have kings, but I think a real question for people in leadership in those countries is it immoral not to do geoengineering today? And I really mean it as a question. I don't mean it as a rhetorical question. Is it immoral for countries that are on the front lines of facing very high temperatures, some just by natural weather variation and some due to the CO2 that's being pumped in the atmosphere? Is it immoral for them not to begin to use geoengineering to protect their people today? I think sitting around and waiting for the UN to disperse hundreds of billions of dollars every single year, that sounds like, hope. And hope is not really a very successful strategy.
Well, one thing I find really interesting about geoengineering is that it really hasn't gotten much, if any, attention in the latest political discourse around the country. President Trump is targeting solar and wind and pretty much any other clean energy technology out there. So maybe in an upside-down world, geoengineering is just crazy enough to be an idea that Trump could get behind, or at least not oppose. How crazy is that?
I have a terrific track record of predicting what President Trump will do. I'm batting 0%. And so I'm not going to guess on that one. But I agree that, and if we step back from the U.S., the world does not show lots of signs of reducing CO2 emissions. And so at its core, it sounds crazy. Wait a minute, we can change the weather? But a lot of things sound crazy at first. Like, oh, wait, I don't have to walk from the fields to the town. There's a thing called a car that will take me. Okay, sign me up for that. Or I want to hold a little rectangle and be able to call literally any single person on the planet and talk to them or play any song ever made. That sounds crazy, but those things happened. And so this is a different idea. I think it's an idea that's worth a lot of consideration because people are suffering from high temperatures, unreasonably hot summers today. And that's why I would think about, what would the VP of Common Sense say? The VP of Common Sense would say, that's a fact. Now, what am I supposed to do if I'm on the front lines of facing the consequences of that?
Well, I'm pretty sure the VP of Common Sense job was among those eliminated by the administration.
I want to note that was Amy Harder who said that, not Michael Greenstone.
I definitely think the election of President Trump increases the chances of countries considering geoengineering because of everything you just said.
I think the countries that are on the front lines of damages from climate change, what must it look like to them? We're pursuing energy dominance. Well, that's actually a code word for, hey, we're going to keep letting the CO2 rip. And the rest of the world looks like it's going to keep letting the CO2 rip. Oh, and by the way, maybe we'll find some funds that we'll relabel as new money, but probably a lot of it was actually old money. And we're not even really promising that. And Herculean efforts were made at the last COP to increase those promises. But I think the broad message to countries that are on the front lines are, hey, you're on your own. We wish you well. And if I was hearing that and I was in those countries, I think I'd be looking for plan B. And I'd have to think about how I'm going to take care of my citizens. And if the rest of the world's not going to stop their emissions and no one's going to start sending us money to help adapt to climate change, what's left?
I hear you, Michael, about this thing being crazy and then eventually not being crazy. But I do think some people find it pretty crazy, and not just crazy, but from folks I talk to, there's a few lines of concerns. And one overarching is that this is going to give a pass to our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to say nothing of the perceived scientific uncertainty of this type of technology. So what do you think about that?
It's a great question. I a little bit think of it as let's worry about the first order effects more than the second order effects. And the first order effect of geoengineering or solar radiation management is to reduce temperatures. Temperatures kill people. Hot temperatures kill people to kill people today. And it ultimately turns on a trade-off of, is reducing the number of people who suffer today worth whatever the knock-on effects are going to be? And will they be so great that we shouldn't alleviate suffering today? And to focus on is just giving a license to the oil companies. That's like the knock-on effects of the flap of the butterfly wing, which is, yeah, that's true. It's certainly possible that's going to increase emissions over time. But in some sense, I think it's missing the first order thing that's right in front of us, which is current temperatures are too hot in the summers in too many places, and there's too much human suffering from it. And so are we really supposed to ignore that because we're worried that the flap of the butterfly wing is going to unleash fossil fuel companies from doing what they're built to do, which is to sell fossil fuels? My own view is it may not change their incentives or their opportunities by all that much.
So is it your official recommendation, Michael, that we should go for it on geoengineering?
In the early days of cell phones, I thought people who walked around talking into these little rectangles were incredibly pompous and obnoxious. And I swore to my college friends that if they ever saw me with one of those cell phones, they could kick me or take the cell phone and throw it in the river. Now I can't put it down. So ideas and new things that seem crazy and outlandish, sometimes we get used to them, and sometimes they make our life much better than we imagined they would be.
Did anybody ever try to take your phone and throw it in the water?
Once, Amy. Just once.
And what happened to that person?
They're no longer a friend.
Noted. Next week, I'll share the story of how one ugly bird helped maintain a whole ecosystem and how two researchers calculated the dollar value of its presence. Shocked is part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network. It was produced by Jesse Baker and Eric Nuzum of Magnificent Noise. Our production staff includes Christine Driscoll, Amy Pedulla, Sophie Bridges, Jamie York, and Samantha Henig. Our sound designer is Kristen Mueller. A big thanks to my co-host, Michael Greenstone, a professor at the University of Chicago and director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth. He also serves as executive producer of Shocked, along with Sam Ori, the executive director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth. The Institute combines a 360-degree approach to education with frontier research having an impact in frontline communities globally. The Institute's efforts are driven by the need to balance climate risks with societal growth. To follow or support their work, see our show notes or visit climate.uchicago.edu. For more of my reporting, you can look for me on pretty much any social media. Search Amy Harder, or look for my byline at Axios. This is Shocked. I'm your host, Amy Harder. Thanks for listening.